detention would be so much a part of the American discourse and so much a part of how we have to think about our options in the world going forward in terms of national security. But as Steve Cole began today by saying, in fact, detention has become central to how we understand what our options are for the future. When you talk about de-radicalization, as opposed to, let's say, counter-radicalization, we're talking about people in custody, for the most part, whether they're in prisons in stable societies, prisons in unstable societies, or battlefield captives. And unfortunately, because America was at a relative time of peace at 9/11, the US military did not have the kind of detention expertise and skill. There was no profession of detention as we understand it today. And so, as you know, our efforts to mount a detention effort, separate from an interrogation effort, these are two separate things that come together, was not well developed and was somewhat amateurish. And as a result, we ended up with the Guantanamo that we had for the first few years. We ended up with Camp Bucca and Abu Ghraib. We ended up with the early adventures in Bagram. We didn't do a very good job of it. Now, while this may matter from a moral perspective, it also matters from a security perspective. Because the issue of reintegration was not something the United States was thinking about when it first collected its thousands of detainees on our various battlefields. Now, we have detainees whose numbers, we don't quite know the numbers of, but they're getting much less in Iraq. They're getting much more in Afghanistan, and Guantanamo is not taking any more prisoners these days. And how these people, these detainees, some of whom have been abused, many of whom have been in isolation for a long time, how they are reintegrated matters for a couple of reasons. It matters because if you listen to representatives from Saudi Arabia who have helped to reintegrate the detainees, the problem of radicalization that has been created by the US detention policy has been dangerous and escalating. It doesn't mean that it's something that we can't counter. It just means that we've created something we didn't know we would be creating. So now going forward, we have both to deal with those who have been in captivity and those who we have to let out of captivity or not. And so the US military has done a good job, I would say, overcoming its amateurism and trying to becoming a professional detention force that understands interrogation in a variety of ways. One of the things that I've tried to focus on are the people who have led this effort, both at Guantanamo and elsewhere. Major General Doug Stone is probably the name most well known for transforming American detention policy. How it was transformed, I'm not going to tell you. I'm going to let him tell you that. But it is, and then I will ask him some questions afterwards before you do. But let me tell you a little bit about him. He's a person who might not be your most obvious choice to lead detention reform, because like the rest of the US military, it's not his expertise. His expertise is in a number of things, mostly business and security. He has led a number of companies, technology companies, as the CEO. Right now he runs something called Rail Securities, and he is interested in trains and the security of US trains and trains around the world. But actually, what he's done in the past has been quite extraordinary, because he was sent to Iraq, where Abu Ghraib had taken place, not just to report on it, not to cast blame, not to point fingers, but to fix it. And even from the most dissident critics in the United States, they will come back with reports from Iraq saying that the degree of anger over imprisonment in Iraq is not what it used to be. In fact, it's seen as a legitimate, just regime. There are those who would disagree, but for the most part, those who were the main critics have put their criticism, let's say, on pause. It is this plan that the United States, under General Petraeus and others, has been trying to export to Afghanistan. We have no idea with what kind of success. There are very mixed reports. And a final note in introducing Doug Stone is that there are very few people that understand the difference between what it means to have good conditions, by which I mean halal food, satellite TV, what it means to have legal rights, and what it means to be mistreated. And there are three distinct parts of how we deal with our detention effort and how we affect their reintegration back into the world. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Major General Doug Stone, who will give you his story.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Peter, as well, for the invitation. I would caution you not to put your criticism on pause. I trust that it's the group that's here. I would also tell you I'm stumbling for a place to put my notes. A couple comments at the very beginning. Regardless of your opinion of amateur or otherwise, the fact of the matter is that the U.S. Army has extensive and had extensive detention policies going into this engagement, little doubt. It is a part of Army manuals. It is trained. The individuals who took over had it as a MOS. MPs do it for a living. So I want to put that in context as I begin to talk about my own challenge in engaging here. I also want to correct something. As you look at your program, you will see my name and it'll have RET for retired behind it. The R for reservist often gets confused with retired. I am not retired, I'm a reservist. And there is a distinct difference, as Karen pointed out, in terms of my own intellectual upbringing. Not mentioned as well was 30 months as a general officer between Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iraq, working for General Abizaid and General Petraeus, working to my Pakistani friends when General Kiani was the DGMO. That brings at least some knowledge about the Islamic culture and about what it is that we need to address to bear when you get called by General Petraeus and say, we would like you to come over and lead a task force. Now, for the somewhat naive Major General in the reserves, a task force leadership in combat is a remarkable opportunity. And I took it without knowing that 134 did interrogation and detention. And as my good friend, the author Judith Miller pointed out, my very best friend, Colonel Lito, said, do you have any effing idea what you just signed up for? I didn't, and it wasn't until I got there and spent 30 days under General Petraeus's sort of opportunity to go learn that I found out where the problems were. I'm a man of strong feelings, very strong, and often strong words. Walter Pincus, however, will get nothing on me today. I'm not going to let him lay a hand on me in that regard because I'm now a General Petraeus trained linguist. I will not spit out the wrong words at the wrong time. I also want to point out that for those of you who have not studied the language of those around the world, who have not studied the history around the world, who do not and have not read bin Laden's own writings, you will join the wide range of our flag leadership in the United States military. And for that, I find a sad statement of reality. I would like to point out that the terms of the debate in this fight are what we need to focus on initially. You know, we have the need for an integrated strategy for counter-radicalization. But what if we change the term to counter-ideological addressing, or something that at least understood a context that is not necessarily warfighting? Is it necessarily a war if you don't necessarily agree with the ideology? Does it have to be? And I would contend with you that it isn't necessarily a war as much as it is a difference and distinct difference about an ideological perspective. What if the terms of the debate are more about the terms of definition for global citizen going forward than they are about a war? What if the terms that are framed global war on were just changed to global debate, for which there are serious consequences of life and death, but also definitions of civilizations and how they think and where they go going forward? So, there's value to a common vision. There's value to global alliances. There's value to thinking of de-radicalization as perhaps the capacity for critical thinking. There has to be no single path to extremism, just like there's no single path to counter it. We have to expand the audience to include the nonviolent components of the ideological perspective with those that are from the violent. And to overfocus on one is to diminish the other. It is absolutely essential, and has been at the top of every one of the orders that I've ever issued, that we must empower the mainstream or moderate Ummah to marginalize violent Islamist behavior. In fact, it is that sentence structure that, in my judgment, is the defined end state of the war, if war is your word for choosing. Let me say it again. If the desired end state is to empower the moderate Ummah to marginalize violent Islamist behavior, there's a distinct warfighting distinction, both in strategy as well as in tactic, to address that desired end state. Now, those of you here, I presume, have had to define victory for something. Victory for you is attending college, victory for you is this, victory for you is that. I'm a businessman. I'm also a rancher. And I've also spent a lot of time in combat. It doesn't serve anybody as a leader to not know where it is you want to be and what the defined state of success is. You have to address grievances, most assuredly. But it's also important to understand where it is you come from. I took an oath, many in this room did as well, to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. Those words, punct, period, at the end, were penned by George Washington, signed for the first time by officers at Valley Forge. Everything else afterwards was added to the Civil War, President Eisenhower, etc. That I would support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies. What is the Constitution? It is a rule of law. It is, with the underpinnings of the Declaration, perhaps the most profound human rights statement in the history of civilizations that we know. So to the extent it has those two very material components, as a military leader, how do I take on a function without completing the oath that I was sworn to defend? And what if the practices that I inherit are inconsistent with my definition of that? What if they're inconsistent? Not wrong. There's never a wrong. Moral courage is a matter oftentimes of a right versus another right, not a right versus a wrong. So focus, my friends, on education. Focus, if you will, on an open media. Focus, if you will, on engaging with Muslim religious leaders. I don't see very many in this room, though there may be. But bring the debate into the forefront. All of that I'm describing was behind the changes in interrogation and detention in Iraq. Perhaps not so public, but at the end of the day, every piece you will see has been weaved into the thought and the changes. Why do I mention religious leaders of the Muslim faith? Because they are both secular and non-secular, as is the Quran and the Hadith. To ignore that is as fundamentally incorrect as to ignore our own Constitution and what it really means. It's hard to form that debate, but those that study the leaders that we have to engage against will tell you, as the 33,000 interrogations that I've either had oversight for or participated in, the countless hours of discussion with Iraqi, Qaeda, Taliban in Afghanistan, Petraeus, and the list goes on, will tell you they are, on balance, men and women of a religion, religious warriors. And for most, that is hard to accept. How is it that somebody could believe in their religion so much that they would sacrifice themselves, even if they're intimidated and have fear, their families threatened, etc.? But at the end of the day, they are religious warriors. They have an ideology. They have a history. They come from a perspective. To carry that debate means you must address those fundamental issues. And ladies and gentlemen, I think it's essential that understanding the changes that I'm going to go through rather quickly here, you understand that at least it is critical to understand who the enemy is and who the enemy isn't. An individual in an orange jumpsuit in detention may be the enemy, they may not be the enemy. just because they're in detention doesn't necessarily mean anything. A flat doesn't mean anything. And some of those processes that we use to readdress recidivist rates, etc., were built on that core. There's probably a button that helps me advance. No, here, I'll do it. Don't go too slow and I tend to move faster. The debate that we engaged in is a historic debate about the rule of law and about human rights. Does that sound strange for somebody who has taken the oath to defend the Constitution? If it does, challenge me later in your questions. It is important to understand that enlightened strategies and changes are not a threat to other services of the military. They are simply defense of another. And lastly, that if we don't adapt to tactics, and don't adapt to strategies, and don't change our doctrine, and don't take everything we have in the Pentagon and all the services and take it over and say, here's what I've got to start off with, and then strip search it and change it, we are not serving the American people. It means little in the cattle business if when you go out to brand them, you have a different form of brand that you can't use on a cow. You can throw that brand away and come up with something new. I was going to give you a Walter Pincus moment, but I decided not to. In fact, for those that were probably not born, many of us who were, these words that we face in hostile ideology, global in scope, ruthless in purpose, insidious in method, unhappily, the danger it poses promises to be of indefinite duration. Spoken by a great general, a wonderful president, about a very specific enemy. A very specific enemy. Words that perhaps apply to another very specific set of enemies. But I ask you the question, have they been insidious, enduring, indefinite? Hostile ideologies are a fact of life in civilizations. You are resident at the moment in a capital of a country whose ideologies clash daily. So what? It is the uniqueness of this civilization that we address them. It is also critical, however, to understand when you're dealing with ideologies that expansion of ideals and that effort require recruits. Tactically speaking, you can't be successful in your ideology if you don't recruit. And recruits require a form of radicalization. I will tell you up front that I am a radical. I don't believe my actions have killed civilians, not knowingly. But there can be no doubt that I am a radical for liberty. I, by the way, have no political party and never have. Don't care about that as much as I care about the fundamental freedoms. It is the only reason I gave up jobs and my family and the ranch to go serve in uniform, period. I have no desire to look fancy in uniform or wear the uniform. I love being a Marine. It's a great way to fight. But at the end of the day, it is only about the Declaration, the Constitution, and the fact that my family will be able to continue with those freedoms. So as an individual assigned to, as an individual assigned to Task Force 134, I only carried 2 documents with me. Well, actually 3 after I arrived. The Declaration, the Constitution were with me at all times, just as sort of gentle reminders about what I do for a living. And I didn't particularly carry the Army manual into anything. And furthermore, the Quran, for which I have been successful now in reading 7 times in 3 different languages. Very helpful to understand an ideology that is particularly prestigious and important. Same thing is true about reading the Bible and others. So I came over to work for General Petraeus, not only as his deputy commander, but also the commander of Task Force 134. I came over with this as the well-understood norm for detention. In fact, I would hearken to mention 100 years from now, it may well be these images that we really remember about the war. Isn't that a sad statement of reality? But isn't that an important reminder of what it is that we're doing for a living? It was most assuredly the backdrop to the surge. The concept of losing the surge is not something that the leadership under General Petraeus and others had in their mind. I certainly didn't. I don't recall losing in any business I've ever managed. I don't recall losing in anything, period. It was not in the concept of the lexicon that we would lose on the surge. We came to do a job, and we intended to do it. This, however, was no small issue to have to overcome. First and foremost is to understand who is not the enemy. Second of all is to understand military terms for this war can disable your thought process if it is an ideological aspect you're addressing. They can cripple the way that you think. For me, at the very beginning, then and now, this is, as I coined, the battlefield of the mind. This is an ideological fight. Kinetics work, and kinetics don't work. Civilian status work, civilian status doesn't. Military terms work, and sometimes they don't. It is whatever combination that addresses the ideological bent of those that disagree and that for which we want to defend that matters. Detention is not a pretty thing. Taking individuals into captive on the view that they will be held for security risk, as was the case in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and perhaps for other reasons, which we describe later in Afghanistan, led to as many as 26,000 in total in detention. I'm going to show you numbers where the plans were thought to go as high as 50,000. I'm going to show you conditions in a moment in these camps that are confusing. Is it about the conditions that people live? The amount of sunlight they get? Access to water, food, health care? Of course. Little doubt. No question. A great nation would do nothing less than do the right thing. But is that indeed the real battlefield? What if these rather well laid out and organized camps were exactly what the ideological enemy wanted? Exactly what they wanted to be recruited to. Exactly what they wanted to be brought into in order to recruit others and train. And if exactly what they wanted was to be left alone in 1,000-man compounds in order to be able to continue to grow, what if that is exactly what they want? So what if exactly what we're doing in detention is exactly what the enemy wants? Is that not aiding and abetting the enemy? Indeed, that which we saw in Iraq when I arrived was frightening. To look at numbers that were around 18,000 when I arrived, no capacity to expand, on a down ramp, thinking we would be out of the business in a couple months, therefore no capacity. To understand what the individuals were doing to each other in challenging the guards, to understand the amount of organization inside each compound, that individuals themselves got themselves recruited to come into detention in order to do their recruiting, was a stark revelation and counter to anything anybody else would want to make public. The fact that the United States military, as great as they are, and they are, as remarkable, professional, and patriotic as every one of them is, could be running an organization that was facilitating the enemy, just is not things we want to talk about. And of course, there was no publicity about this. It takes a great leader to allow somebody else to change doctrine, tactics, strategy, all at once under great pressure. And General Petraeus was that leader. He allowed me to do what I thought I needed to do. Most assuredly, he would have fired me had I done it wrong. Most assuredly, the letter of termination that I gave him, resignation when I gave him when I arrived, said, if it ever happened, I would have been used. But the fact of the matter is, and I've said this publicly many times, It was General Petraeus' understanding of my assessment, despite the critique and the pressure and the push and the misunderstanding of everybody else, for which every other program that I'm going to move through was said no to. Funding stopped by congressional leaders. Every imaginable dimension to push against it. It was General Petraeus who understood and allowed it to go forward. What if de-radicalization is simply the equal to the capacity to conduct critical thinking? There are great Muslim leaders. A great empire was formed. And history abounds with the kind of leadership out of the Muslim community that would stand beside me and allow me to change. And they did. It was not easy to pick up the phone and call the leaders of the Muslim community and say, I have a problem. Most Muslim leaders at this stage were not in the mood to say, let me return a call to a Marine general running interrogation and detention in Iraq. But over time, they did. And some of my dearest friends are in this room today. This was the challenge that I was given. We will exceed 40,000 in detention before the surge is over. If a compound is recruiting at a fairly significant rate, if the processes that you have them will facilitate the enemy, what is this number? This number grows the enemy. But that makes a basic and flawed assumption that everybody in detention is the enemy. So what if they're not? If they're not, you would begin to look at a program that would cause releases. Releases. Detention. Release. What does that bring to all the military members in this room? You, blank, you are going to release the killers of my fellow soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen, Coast Guard. The answer to that is, on balance, numerically, for every detainee released, one American dies. Historically. That's a recidivist statistic. So the question then becomes, how many enemy do you grow if you keep them when they shouldn't be detained and allow them to be recruited? The answer to that is significantly higher. So the question then becomes, how do you release them? Well, this is the process that I inherited. An individual was captured because they were a security risk based on the judgment of the leader on the ground at the time. A book was made with the statements. Actually, a numerical score was given to the individual. And then they were put in 1,000-man compounds. No particular process for release, no particular process for adjudication of the case, no particular process for anything. In fact, would it surprise you if I said the detainee was never fully informed or even understood or had a chance to counter why it is he was detained? Would that surprise you? Some here wouldn't. Many would. It really did surprise me to watch the detainees come in, to be put in compounds, and to be kept there for a year or two without any clarification as to why they were actually there. Now, there is a process. Don't let me say it wasn't real. But let me just say it certainly wasn't rigorous enough. And I'm going to give you a statistic in a few slides that will tell you why I say that. Then, when the overcrowding became so great that we would violate the human rights standards or the International Red Cross standards, a general officer would go down to SCORE, labor over the decision, and let somebody loose. You see, there's only two people in the military in Iraq who can detain and who can release. That's General Petraeus and my decision. I can put anybody into detention, and I can release anybody I want. Just that simple, and so can General Petraeus. But if you define the facilities in a manner that's profoundly different, consistent with the charter that I aforementioned, and said that it's basically a society, you will begin to understand how it is that you might want to be kept in detention or that were you. I could take you through great history about Americans kept in a sugar plant in New York by the British. Would it surprise you that 3 times the number of American patriots in the Revolutionary War died in detention than died on the battlefields of the Revolution? Equally profound patriots died 3 times, no less than 2, in detention in New York. My son-in-law just left, Lieutenant Colonel, just left for Afghanistan. If he were taken into detention by the enemy, I would expect him to be treated in the exact same manner in which I treated detainees. Period. So, what would that society look like? Well, you would define the society inside detention based on your understanding or perception of what it is that you want versus the ideology. If you're addressing the ideology, then you first need to understand who's got the ideological orientation. So you have to start to study the individuals, and then you have to begin to layer programs that not only help you assess them, but also help you move them out. So that what? If you're going to have large numbers of detainees, and by the way, ladies and gentlemen, I'm ambivalent about the number. Towards the end, I began to say, give me 1 million men. Give me 1 million into detention. I'll give you 998 back that'll fight for us. So give me 2 million in detention. Now, most of my human rights friends, etc., were panicked on statements like that. But if you think about it in the context of a program, a process, is it so wrong? We studied in great depth, for the first time ever, who was in detention. And this is just one slide of hundreds of slides about who was in there. I just happened to pick this one. We're fighting hardened warriors, right? Ideological, sons of bin Laden, every one of them. The fact of the matter is they were farmers and unemployed students who, on balance, needed $300 to take care of the fact that a standard detainee, an average detainee, was 29 years old, married, had 5 children, lived with his entire extended family, and there was no job. So farmers and students, unemployed students, made up the vast majority of detainees in those purple suits. When you take a look at the motivations, the real motivations to put them in there, they list out like this. Now, what if down at the bottom, the motivation for religious jihad equals about the group that were incented to fight because of something we did on the ground? Where's the ideological bent there? So when you start to have these kinds of numbers in detention and break them out, you have to redefine the program. And the program was aligned by one goal, the first line in the sentence, to provide care and custody. It's really no different in Gitmo and elsewhere today. Gitmo wants to assure that nobody is recalcitrant, that they are mild-mannered, that they are controlled. That's an important criteria because if you're doing physical violence to yourself or others, that's disruptive, of course. But is that really the issue? When I'm in my academician mode, I'm very calm, very cool, very cool. Not the least bit disruptive. But my mind is thinking of ways to destroy the competition, advance my ideological brand, and I get better at it as I sit there and think over time. So is my peacefulness and calmness, my care and custody, the sole measure of what's happening to me and to others? My dear friend, Sheikh Adla, will tell you, well, I will tell you because he may not, because you do wonderful man, that the most difficult challenges he will have ever had in his program are with those that have come to him from the Informal Law. And I'll tell you why. Because if I'm a Pakistani and I come out of a Deobandi perspective, and I mix with somebody else who has and you mix these ideologies together, exactly how does the Sheikh reorient that thinking in his program? He can't even unwire what it is that the guy wired himself. So if the battle's on the ideology, you have to understand it and break it apart, and most assuredly, address the insurgency inside. So, like a military leader, I laid out the plan. Notice we're going to apply counterinsurgency techniques inside the detention center. That's what the military has changed its doctrine on. And I think that's good. There's nothing wrong with that. It does, however, ignore the large piece of this, but there's nothing wrong with it. That detention centers are not POW camps sitting behind the lines waiting for the war to be over is probably a nice and appropriate change. But the concept that there's an insurgency going on for the battlefield of mind is what needs to be addressed. And furthermore, that those individuals in detention, particularly when the numbers are big, are part of an outward reach, an outreach to change and create a social epidemic that is in favor of a changed ideology that is consistent with what it is that the leadership wants. Not only in American leadership, I'm in the leadership of the country that we are partnering with. So we, first of all, isolated, for the first time, detainees out of those large groups. And I can tell you war stories about how I was accused of going to kill everybody and putting them in these really luxurious hotels. And they were air-conditioned, private, small spaces, plenty of exercise. But it served a purpose. The few ideological-oriented groups could be isolated from each other because there aren't very many. And I would ask Peter Bergen and others when they get up here to answer a question for you. How many hardcore, I am worried about them type Qaeda exist in the world today? How many? How many then are an influence a little bit around them, and a little bit around them, and a little bit around them? If detention is any example, it may be as little as 1 in 1,000 or somebody you really need to worry about. That's in detention, when we decided to grab them all and put them in there. So what we decided to do was help them understand their own ideology and the 80-some arguments used against them. To do that, they had to learn to read. And so they started to read. To do that, we had to take the youth aside, separate them from the adults, and allow them to have a youthful experience taught, by the way, and my congressional members here, I hope will understand that I've been accused of having Baptist ministers do this. Please understand, Baptist ministers on balance that I know do not know Islam and do not teach the Quran. This was done strictly and solely by individuals, imams that we recruited from across the world and ultimately in Iraq in big numbers. All this teaching was done by local members. Vetted, of course. Fired and hired, of course. Multiple programs were put in place. The much debated voluntary religious discussion group. How is it that you could, in detention, be teaching religion? It's not about teaching religion. It's not about teaching religion. It's about letting detainees themselves who want to understand their religion, attending the school after they're attended by religious leaders, to just simply understand it. And oh, by the way, to the extent that they can address the 80-some arguments that Al-Qaeda uses and takfirists use to convert them into a more radical perspective of the ideology, that ain't all bad. Because if it isn't obvious to the intuitive observer, the vast majority of Muslims aren't violent Islamists. And that those individuals are every bit the enemy of the Muslim faith than anybody else could be. It is essential to understand where that alignment is. Empower the moderate to marginalize the violent Islamists. And that's what was going on in detention. The same thing was true for women's programs. We had to import Chechen counselors who had to deal with suicide bombers to be able to deal with women. We had to, and we created work programs in order to be able to do what? Give them something to do? Sure. It's like Georgia with breaking bricks. I don't care about, I'm sorry, I had a year in Georgia when I used to watch the chain games. They don't do that anymore, I don't think. But I'm just trying to emphasize. Work programs have one purpose, to tire people out, and another purpose, which was mine, to provide them income, preferably $300, in order to address the fundamental underlying reason they got there in the first place. And to the third phase of the operation, to create a social epidemic. Because you know what happens when a detainee actually has money? Who do you think they give it to? Think about it. We're going to come to it in a second because it's a part of the solution. The second thing we did was bring warring parties together in hopes that these brothers wouldn't fight each other. And you know what? As a side note, we found they actually weren't warring before they got in. Shia and Sunni had been intermarried and were brothers over and over again. In fact, one of the great and most interesting statistics is they're almost all intermarried. There isn't exactly this issue. They're not even as hardcore as Republicans and Democrats in the city. But along the way, they were able to settle their issues. The one that was the most contentious, the most refuted, the pushback the hardest, was on this one issue. That detainees could be allowed to explain their situation to those that captured them. Some of you saw this program. This is perhaps the greatest change to allow a detainee
to stand in front of individuals who have both the classified and unclassified and explain their situation. Now, to the point that I made earlier, after I was able to get individuals to sit in these chairs and represent clearly what was going on in the tactical situation, which was non-trivial, why is it the military wouldn't want to sit down and do that? You assess that yourself. But guess, after they swept through the entire population of detainees, just guess, they were given, remember, I'm the only one who can release it in General Petraeus and detain. So they had no authority to do it. No authority. But they could make 3 recommendations: release, hold, or put into programs. And the reason we have the 2 distinction at the end is because they didn't have enough teachers, enough programs to put everybody in at the very beginning. Ultimately, we had enough to do that, so it was down to 2 choices: hold and put in programs, or release. So just take a wild guess of the nominally 26,000 that we were doing at this time, what the percentage was recommended release. How many think less than 10%? How many think more than 90%? What if I told you 72% were voted for release? What would that say about those that were in detention? What would that say about the revelation of understanding a different perspective? What would that say about the rule of law? That at some level it works. I'm not saying that these had representatives. They didn't. I'm not saying all the things that we would have and enjoy in this country they had. But this is a different way to be in detention. Because what happens then is that entire experience is used to defeat the insurgency because it is empowering them to understand the value of education that they want, the value of their own religion, which they want, the value of jobs and employment skills, which they need, the value of income and setting it up, which they must have, the value, as I'm going to show you, of their own rule of law, the value of a judgment, the value of conduct associated with civic behavior. That's not just me being some sort of, whatever. This is about real civilizations and real societies coming together in a different environment that we call detention. Notice the guy looking with his glasses at the case. General Petraeus came down, this was so contentious, that he sat on this case. Now, my Arabic is pretty good, and this was an Qaeda member. Qaeda, no. General Petraeus, after reviewing the case, released it. I about fainted. I told him, sir, you got the wrong guy. I said, no, I didn't. Release it. We even fought about it. General Odierno and I, but we released it. He never returned to the fight. But imagine a great leader sitting down and making a tough decision. Most here in the human rights environment, etc., would never have any concept that that general went to do that. He would neither have the concept that his security guard, not on this day, but on another day, said, sir, he will not be permitted to go into the compound. They will harm him, hurt him, and I won't let it happen. So I said, General, I can't let you go in there. He goes, why? I said, sir, he put his finger in my face and said, Doug, I want you to do what you think is right. You knew full well what was going on. So what I did to the compound is said to them, Bil Arabi, in Arabic, I am a son of Abraham, and you know me. I'm going to introduce you to my commander, who himself is a son of Abraham. On the rules of the son of Abraham, he will come in this compound and meet you. And within instance, he was surrounded. There was no way possible for a detainee to not take him and choke him or do anything he wanted. There was no way possible for a security guard to get to him. And General Petraeus moved all the way through that compound. All the way through it, completely unharmed. And then, as he was walking out, and one of the only things that I could describe about the power of the general is they all started to do this. 34 compounds, by the way. Some of them not, going down this path. But a lot of them are, because we're walking down City Road, right down the middle. Petraeus, Petraeus, Petraeus. And he turned to me and said, you put them up to one? I said, sir, how am I going to put these guys up to that? But understand the value of being in detention and seeing fair, valued treatment from a country whose ideology you now are coming to understand. What does that say when you now start to bring their families in? Used to be 3,000, then it went to 300,000. We had to build extra rooms. In fact, let me be careful how I say that. The detainees built extra rooms. The detainees built these facilities. The Iraqi guards met these individuals. When they came in, they got to learn the same material that the detainees were getting. We knocked down the wall disallowing detainees to hold their children. Knocked it down and said you can hold your children all you want. You get some kind of bad stuff and bring it back in, that's not going to be permitted again. They didn't do it. They wanted to hug their children. Imagine the value, I mean, that's trivial. I get that that's trivial. But it ain't trivial when you're in detention. And it's not a big effort to let them hug it either, unless you understand the manual. Try to go to the federal prison and do that. Now, once you start to think about it this way, the families are now agent for it. And what Karen said, amongst the many metrics, and I am a management by metric guy, period. You don't become a CEO, chairman of the board, doing what I did, without measuring by metrics. I mean, period. You manage what you can measure. And I measured everything. Everything. Sometimes misunderstanding what I was measuring, but measuring it. And the understanding of what was happening in the polls inside Iraq about detention, the changes in the Arabic world with Al Jazeera and others that I met with, was material. And that was my job. Win the surge. Support my commander. Support the initiative. Follow my oath. It was all about war fighting, all about business. But at the end of the day, what it does is give you a lesson about how we might be able to extend this beyond. There are authors here who have taken a shot at publishing that. We also brought in the judicial component. 26 judges died while I was there. This one lived, I think. Can you imagine the bravery it takes to stand in front of every detainee with their family? I'd be identified by your face and say, this is Iraq, and it's not the way we want you to behave. So sign this pledge, built on something from 1954, and move forward. What brave men we were privileged to serve with. And then we did something that broke the back of the opinion. We brought them all in for releases. We brought the administration in for the releases, surrounded by bodyguards. Eventually, like General Petraeus, they waited amongst them. And then I did something that I have to share with you, particularly for the couple tables of press. We had every group that was released sent over to another tent, hundreds at a time. We let the entire press corps, 44 different nations, 44 different periodicals, cameras, etc., go visit them. Ask them any question they want. There was only one reporter from one nation that asked every detainee every time, tell me about how you were tortured. And I would love to tell you the name, but I'm afraid that won't get out. It wasn't Arabic. This alone solved and settled the issue about detention. That it was completely open. And for the first time, I was given permission, limited however it was, to bring in the press and let them actually see what was going on in detention. I would have shown it at the very beginning, and I would have shown it every day, were it that I had my way. But there are security reasons for not doing it, and there are things that protect the detainees against their visual formation to be seen that are important. Then they were released, and then we began to measure what the effect was. And I could give you hours of measurements. But let me just show you. And I'm going to point to this chart over here. This is April when I arrived. June is when the surge started. These were the peaks of disturbances, riots, escapes, murders, tunneling. All of that was when we said, now we're going to add another 20,000 detainees. Imagine if you're the commander and you've got that going on, and they're going to say, now add 20,000 more. Does that feel like a good solution, a good problem to have? But look what happened as we did that. As we climbed from 18,000 to ultimately 26,000 detainees. Look what happened. It steadfastly went down. Look what happened to recidivist rates. Now, some of you say, well, you can't really measure it. That is not true. Every detainee has his eyes, fingerprints, all of it red, period, 0. That's not a question. We know whether they come back or they don't, period. Not a debate, not at this time. This is the growing recidivist rate that you saw up to April. Now the programs I just showed you, look what happened. Every single program. Now releasing more than we have ever released. Look at the recidivist rate crater and drop down to ultimately less than 1%. Less than 1%. And guess who joined in onto this? Now the commanders in the field who were highly skeptical, as you would be, of releases. You all remember catch and release. I mean, there were people who authored those things here. You should catch, and you should release. But you ought to do something in between. And so the question then becomes, what happened? Why did it get better? And the answer is because commanders in the field started to understand this. Great enlightened major generals in the Army pulled these guys in and created those programs and extended them to the extent they could before they released them out in society. Many programs we had hoped to fund, because we didn't have the funds, they were able to do with their CERP funds. Give them jobs, check back in, blah, blah, blah. Another reason not to return to the fight. Another reason to keep our troops alive. Another reason to be successful in the ideology. This was ultimately the full program. I'm not going to take time to walk the dog for you on this, but there are more boxes on this than there were at the very beginning. Now, Afghanistan. I came back a couple months ago after being asked by General Petraeus to go over and Ambassador Holbrooke to report to Ambassador Eikenberry and General McChrystal and give my assessment. I can't give you that complete report. A, it's 700 some pages. B, I don't really have permission to distribute it. But I do have permission to talk about the highlights, and that's what we're going to talk about here. What if there are so few detainees in a country that you're in under U.S. custody that they really can't do much by way of this program? Now, you can. Every one of the nominally 600-ish or so that are out there are an opportunity, and you have to have programs. The year before, I made the recommendation under the auspice of Admiral Mullen, who sent me over to go look at the program, and the new program they have now was funded a year ago, and those buildings and those dollars are being thrown against it. So the U.S. side of this looked to me and felt to me as though it was getting healthier. Now there's more about that and changes we need to make and advancements. And to my first point, you cannot be satisfied with anything ever. So don't read into me, oh, everything's happy, let it be. That's not the case. I would change everything all the time if I thought it was necessary. But the real issue here is different. It is that our actions in the country are driving more through a different system and driving them more into the prison system. So some of you would say, that's fine, that's their prison system, they can do that. Not me. To me, that is as equal a violation as if they were in our detention centers. So it's not okay to ignore it if you're the operating entity along with the coalition in a country. You're the one perturbating the system. So what's happened here is basically the attacks that were being taken place from, and all the ones you've read about, were all being managed from inside the Afghan prison. That's where they're coming from. So the next attack is really being organized from there. And this is no surprise. When General Petraeus asked me to go over, he said, tell me your intellectual construct. I said, here it is. And I drew it on a piece of paper. I said, you're asking to have these functions, and this was the great May meeting at NDU. You're asking to have these functions aligned and engage with the civilian population. And I said, sir, in my studies, we will lose this, and we have lost every other war that smacks of an insurgency if there aren't alignment on three issues. If we do not have the political will of our people and theirs, if we do not have some actual warfighting strategy that makes sense, and if we are not able to isolate the enemy, we will lose. It doesn't make any difference. Why is Pakistan important to Afghanistan? Because Pakistan is a sanctuary, and in that upright corner, it doesn't allow us to exclude them from the fight. Why is counterinsurgency an adaptation to conventional warfare? Needs to be improved on, of course, but counterinsurgency is a new war strategy, or a war strategy to address a different set of issues. It needs to change as well, per my earlier comment. And what value is political will? Now, Peter Bergen and others already mentioned, there's a real war going on. This is real. I mean, there's a real threat. We can't ignore it. Whatever we do, forget about how many troops it is, etc. It's the issue of addressing the real threat, the ideological threat we can't ignore. If we can't keep the political will behind that, and they can't keep the political will to fight, then the ideological orientation has won. By definition, it has won. So, with that, we went into all the prisons. And what we found was that the violent Islamic few were taking over the vast majority of genuine criminals. That the criminals were shrinking and becoming a part of the system. What we found was the rule of law is rather unique in Afghanistan. The actual formal rule of law, and these are my estimates, they are only my work, I don't pretend anything else, is very different. It is elongated. It takes a lot of time. Steal a chicken in the upper rank, you may be in for 6 months, 9 months, or a year before you ever should get your case. And then it can be voted out, voted in, appealed, and you're held during the entire process. So study the rule of law in Afghanistan and understand it before you actually write and speak about it. Understand it. Now look at the tribal one below, the informal. Steal the chicken, you get investigated, individuals meet about it, and they decide, and that happens in 2 or 3 weeks. So who has the informal law in Afghanistan? Who really runs it? I'm out of a tribal culture. That's where I started my life, with my father and my grandmother. Trust me when I tell you, Indian nations in the United States of America are separate entities. They have their own law. Study them. The Dini, the Navajo are the best, in my judgment. But individuals make decisions that are not federal in orientation. So when you begin to study it, and these are my estimates, not anybody else's, that about 80% of what goes on in Afghanistan is the informal system, not the formal. And when you take a look at what Taliban offers, Sharia, which, by the way, should not say law, Sharia meaning God's law. So when you, please, in fact, let me just put this out there. You do not say Sharia law. Why? Because Sharia means God's law. So what you're really saying, and if you would stop it, I've tried to get everybody, including some of the most profound newscasters, to get this right. You do not say Sharia law, because that is saying God's law. Please understand it. Help, along with the rest of the ideology, to get it right. And I'm sorry to my Arabic speakers if I've violated anything there, but I think not. Look at the Pashtun-Wali code, watered down as it may be these days, but nonetheless there. Taliban justice, etc. And then ask yourself, what is the rule of law? What is the ideological bent? I'm not going to go through something here that I would like to spend a lot of time on. It's probably the one thing that I genuinely know the most about today that I didn't know much about 4 years ago. And that is actually how individuals are radicalized. But let me leave it with you that it almost doesn't matter. The first shots in the United States, before I became the United States, were fired at Lexington and Concord. They were fired because the British were chasing 2 men. The big signature on the Declaration, John Hancock, and the firebrand, Sam Adams. Hancock flipped all the tea over and torqued off the merchants and the British. And Adams was leading the radicals, who, by the way, some have defined as terrorist actions. And to the extent that you wait for families to be in bars when you attack the Brits, that's a pretty compelling argument. They were radicalized for liberty, radicalized for freedom. So let's be careful when we start branding individuals with terms. Terrorism, whether it be in Algeria, Napoleon in Spain, whether or not be in our own country, in Vietnam, and I could run all through the wars for you, is the beginning stage of all insurgencies. The beginning stage of all insurgencies. So don't panic over the concept. Prisons in Afghanistan have become systematically radicalized. And you can read this. This is Al-Qaeda recruiting literature and pictures. You can see, if I spent the time with you, on how overcrowded they have become. Another huge implementation, a huge effector of radical behavior. Taking a look at these pictures will just give you a sense of it. The population itself, by my measurements, are not only just those that are somewhat oriented, but are growing in terms of their belief in the radical orientation. They are being recruited, they are being trained, they are being measured. They are creating battles, not just outside, as I pointed out, but with inside. And these are murders, these are assassinations, these are external attacks, these are attacks on the guards inside the prisons. So what's happening in our efforts to do the right thing, rule of law, put people into overcrowded jails, is that they, without programs, is that they are doing exactly what we had in detention, radicalizing. And therefore, I submit, we are creating more problems for Afghanistan long term than we are solving it. I'm gonna move because I'm getting the nod here. This, by the way, is a well-run prison. We, for my good friends who want to make this argument for and against, need to understand our presence using a different rule of law, which is well-intentioned, is also creating a huge number that go into these prison systems. And because we lack a unified command to address it all, we are stumbling on it. So the 10 conclusions that I came up, this has 700 pages of program specifics behind it, is that there's no plan, we don't classify who goes in, there's no coherent rule of law, they're being radicalized and there's no program to address it, there's no way to sustain the prison system. It bothers me beyond belief the amount of money we spend in areas in these war zones and never spend on these prisons, where it is the prisons that are the vast majority of the war. If the ideology is the war, and it is. So it is an anathema to me that we don't like those funds, but they are locked up in somehow government funds. Corrections reform, which they want, intelligent policy, which actually uses the sources that want to be used, dealing with projected overcrowding, leadership, and command and control. In a sense, we have to reclaim this strategy. Now, I'm prepared to talk about Guantanamo. This is my lead, and I probably won't get the chance. But let me just point out that in dealing with this battlefield of the mind, it is not okay to deal with it in an insular, stovepiped manner. There are those all around this circle that have to be engaged not only in the countries that we're in, but on the globe writ large. It is essential to have alliances. It is essential to gain the respect to the extent that is required to defend our own nation, because at this particular moment, I think it is the most hopeful time in the last 7 or 8 years that we've had. It doesn't feel like it, I understand. But if you think about the modest and moderate changes and changes that have begun to happen, it is possible we are at the most hopeful turn in this ideological war. It is possible that 2 billion Muslims may be engaged in a conversation. It is possible that moral leadership may now be able to make changes without being themselves taken to task, to reframe the debate, to define victory, to allow military doctrine to be changed on the fly and adaptive as is necessary. And we may be having leaders now who believe in that, and to elevate the debate far beyond the violent to include the nonviolent. With that, we'll take questions.
Thank you, General Stone. I'm going to start up with a question and open up to the floor. And my question is rather actually simple, which is that for your figures, 75% of the Guantanamo detainees have been released. Same figure that you used for our detainees in Iraq. But now we turn to Afghanistan, where, as we heard last night, the issue of Guantanamo and the releases from Guantanamo have become a virtual West Point, I believe was the phrase, West Point for jihadi recruits and leaders. So my question to you is, how much does timing have to do with anything? Because in Afghanistan, we're not just facing people, as in Iraq, who are picked up and dealt with in the way you're talking about. We're dealing with a population that has been detained for a long time, like our Guantanamo detainees. In fact, we actually don't know as much as we need to know. You probably know more than the rest of us in the room. But to what extent does the degree of the length of time they've been incarcerated under conditions very unlike what you've described have to do with the success rates that you would predict, both in terms of de-radicalization and re-entry into society?
Anybody that is held in a program where legal constructs are not a rule of law is not engaged in, that they don't understand. Now, let me make it clear. Those that are in detention who are religious warriors are not going to believe in the rule of law that you might be familiar with in the United States. Are not going to accept that. So we have to be clear about what we're talking about. But I'm trying to use the generic term rule of law, one that is not immediately engaged in some understanding of how they're there, why they're there, what the construct is, and that debate must begin. Who doesn't have that immediately start, and simultaneously doesn't have an awareness of a cultural awareness in human rights from the very beginning all the way through, will be, to use the sort of simple parlance, more radicalized over time. To the point, and this is not a question for me, this is for a good doctor here, for him to tell you what it is that I know because I've been there and seen them, that they are wired and cannot be unwired, in some cases forever. Them and engage the ideology. That is the only thing that matters, along with, of course, the community, the family, etc., and that whole list that I showed before. So the answer is, it don't get better with time if you don't address it. Comma, if you do address it and you do engage in it, it actually can get better. Witness the remarkable achievements of our friends in the kingdom.
General Mike Pesner, Senate Intelligence Committee. Very compelling presentation, thank you. The United States, starting June 30th, has withdrawn from Iraq cities in the process, if it hasn't been completed yet, turning over the prison population to the Iraqi government. In your assessment, do they understand these principles that you outlined, and what is the danger that we're going to go back to square one with that transfer?
The guards that I had, the academies that I created, were all systematically trained in these concepts. Every individual who addressed a detainee, whether it be an educator, imam, psychiatrist, psychologist, social worker, all of those individuals were, and let me just use generically, Iraqi. The program was Iraqi. Empower the moderate Ummah to marginalize the violent Islamists. They were Iraqi. Those individuals were moved to the new center that we designed at Taji. Most are at Taji or Cropper today. The numbers are not for me to disclose. They are certainly less than they used to be, and the program will be turned over to the Iraqis, sans a few that are, under different status. My ardent hope is that the Iraqi administration, who we have done everything under my tour, and I trust others have done as well, will take it on. But it is naive to think that prison systems that have really been the hotbed of violent Islamic behavior, I don't care, you go back to Egypt with Sayyid Qutb, you can go on and on and on, have not been the cradle of many of these beliefs. So I think it is naive to think that every tendency in the rubber band will be that it goes back. I ardently hope it doesn't. But as a pragmatic and sort of practiced guy, I think it will slide back before somebody catches it. Some heroic action of some civic leader reaches in and says, it isn't what we want. But when they make that change, they have to make the change across the entire penal system. And that will be a good thing.
Yeah, Chen, freelance correspondent, Bethesda, Maryland. Thank you for you talking about the faith in U.S. detention policy in the field. In your chart, talk about the release and the re-internment. I have a question is this, what's the reason for those internment? And what's the population of internment among the release? And the last question is, what's the current population of the internment? Thank you.
Could I have some clarification? Are you speaking about Iraq, Afghanistan, or both? What are you?
It depends on what's your curve. I think
okay.
It's about Afghanistan, right?
I'm not sure. Let me answer them both, just because I'm not quite clear on which chart you're speaking about. We started in Iraq at 18. We went to 26. There were a total of 40-some thousand through that entire process. I am led to believe by numbers that I've read in the press, they're down around 8 or below now. You can call and ask them. They're mostly in the status of the detention center program at Taji and Cropper. Camp Buka, under our strong recommendation, has been closed. And a great tribute to the great individual Buka, who was a great American. So I'm glad that that facility no longer exists. In Afghanistan, the numbers are reasonably small. I can't speak to whether they're growing or not. I just actually don't know. I mean, I was there 8 weeks ago, but things change. But on balance, they're not even equal to one of the 34 compounds that were in Iraq. The prison system, however, is growing. And that percentage is what was projected to be shown here. And I don't know how big they'll ultimately get to. What we do know and suspect both on the penal management and corrections management side is that at least a third of those individuals are really there from an ideological bent. The narco mix is mixed in with criminal. But again, those numbers are really for the commands to kind of inform you about. The trend is that they're going up. I think in the U.S., well, certainly in Iraq, the trend is it's going down and turned over for adjudication by the for the legal system in Iraq. And then I would guess that the same kind of thing will happen in Afghanistan going forward.
And what's the reason for internment?
I'm sorry, the reason for internment in Iraq was that they violated the security, they were assessed to be a security risk according to the UN mandate, completely permitted to be done. They were brought in, again, sometimes in a very confusing manner. There's no true evidence that has to be there for that. They're not tried. It's a UN security risk construct. The construct for which you're held in Afghanistan is the same as that which you're held in Guantanamo, and there are different legal rules associated with it. In the prison system in Afghanistan, the Afghan prison system, your case is adjudicated, and you're either held in there because you're waiting for trial, or you've had trial, and that's gone through a legal system, and the same thing is true in the Iraqi penal system.
We're out of time. Please join me in thanking you.
Thank you.